I just found this interview with Whitney, Webb, and Natalie Brunell, and it's actually blown my mind. I've listened to most of this, and I want to bring some of this stuff up to you. Debt crisis is something that we're all dealing with, right? If you look at the U.S., debt is spiraling out of control, and I want to play this clip here and talk to you a little bit about this because I do think as 98% of countries are moving towards central bank digital currency and testing different pilots, I want to touch base on this because I think this is really important. So let's play this.
When you mention the debt crisis and you kind of see that a couple of years out, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we've spoken in the past about this controlled demolition of the financial system that you see happening, and obviously they need something for us to move to. Yeah. And a lot of people, I think, at this point think, oh, CBDCs, that's not going to be a concern, at least not here in the United States, because we're going to push back, and we also have Bitcoin. But you bring up the stablecoin path that policymakers might want to take. So how will this debt crisis actually play out? Because one thing I've been amazed by, especially when I look at the current economic situation globally, is we can just kick the can down the road, and as soon as there's a mini panic or it feels like we're about to hit a bust, something comes in to rush in and provide liquidity or save it, and all of a sudden we're fine. We recover, new all-time highs in the stock market. I mean, how is this going to play out that we actually we go over the cliff, we hit a crisis?
Yeah, so in the case of any sort of controlled demolition, I don't think they want it to happen until they're ready for it to happen. And so, they're going to wait for certain metrics to be met before it kicks off. So obviously, like I mentioned earlier, with all this stuff around COVID-19, it seems like the economy was in major trouble before COVID. And if COVID hadn't happened when it did, we could have had an economic crisis then without the excuse to, basically print trillions of dollars as, this is our response to the lockdown and the pandemic. I mean, like I said, it was happening before.
Remember, COVID-19 hit every country pretty hard, and every country was dealing with high inflation prices due to printing money, as well as the entire structure of getting, food and materials from one country to another kind of broke down, right? All the shipping and things like that got delayed. Things weren't getting built. People weren't showing up to factories and workers, right? Because everyone was forced to stay home. And so that really caused this really huge spike in inflation all around the world. And I think we've been dealing with that over the last few years, and just now getting to the point where things are kind of getting towards that 2% level where the Fed feels comfortable, where they're starting to lower rates, right?
And they found a way to make it keep rattling on for a little longer.
Yeah.
But they know they can't do that forever, right? Because it's a mathematical inevitability that eventually the debt catches up with us if something different isn't done. And again, a lot of the solutions I think they're going to propose are going to be things that people would not normally accept were it not a time of crisis. And so when you have a crisis and people are really stressed out
and scared,
especially if it has to do with their money or losing their money or losing their purchasing power, I think you'll see people sign on to things that they normally would not sign on to. So again, I think it's very likely that we're going to see dollar stable coins proliferate. And I think part of this too is that, the Fed has essentially said for a few years now that it makes the most sense to do stable coins. You have former top people in the CIA saying that stable coins make a lot more sense than a CBDC. And they say that because, digital dollar stable coins are already here, and they're already servicing the debt through their, mass purchases of treasuries, right? And so
I just really want to point this out because a lot of people don't understand how these stablecoin companies make money. And I want to just explain this really quickly. So what stablecoin company do is, like, Tether made $5 billion last year, right? And that's more than Goldman Sachs made. And it's really funny because I think it was BitBoy. He went down to the Bahamas and he went down to like the, Tether's office, and he was looking around and he found this like bank vault door that wasn't very big, and it didn't look like you could fit a lot of money in there. But most of this is backed up by U.S. Treasuries. And so what they'll do is, if somebody comes along and they need $1 million worth of stablecoins, they will go ahead and buy them, and the company Tether will go and buy $1 million worth of treasuries. That's how it's supposed to be, right? There's really no valid way to back up if Tether has enough funds to back up. I think, what is it? They have $119 billion, right? So they need $119 billion worth of treasuries or other securities to back up this value, right? And I think that's what she's talking about here too. And so that's how they make money. So Tether is making, 4 or 5% on $119 billion. That's how these stablecoin companies are making money. And that's why you have companies like Ripple getting into it. And I think companies like Ripple are getting into it because they understand that when they go and sit down in front of a bank or a different client, an institutional client, and that client says, I'm very interested in stablecoins. Do you have a solution for me, right? They have the cross-border payment solution. They have the CBDC solution, and now they're going to have the stablecoin solution. So how I see this is that every bank, right, or every corporation or any business can have their own type of stable coin, right? So Wells Fargo could have their own stable coin, Citibank, Chase Bank, all these different banks could have their own stable coin and move value simultaneously from bank to bank. Or if they want to go from Chase to Wells Fargo, you could use some type of bridge asset in between those stable coins. So I just think it's pretty interesting. Or if those stable coins were on the same network, that could settle instantly. So very interesting.
You know, if they were to do a CBDC project or something like that, it would take them several years to develop, and they'd be behind a lot of other countries in the world. Whereas if they make the switch to dollar stable coins and make that the preferred currency of American consumers, then, you know, they sort of avoid those problems that way and still are able to obtain the surveillability and programmability through these public-private partnerships with the private stablecoin issuers that they would have even if it was a CBDC, right? So I think, you know, to make that switch, they can just be like, well, you know, maybe your dollar in this, maybe these banks failed and you think your money may be gone, but we'll give you the same amount of money that you had in your bank, but in the form of these stable coins or something, and you can redeem them here. I mean, pretty much most Americans, I think, would do that to not, you know, lose all their money instantly, right? And so I think it's likely that we're going to see some sort of situation like that. I mean, remember back to the regional banking crisis with Silicon Valley Bank, it seems very likely that a lot more of that is going to happen. And I think you could actually look at that crisis, which arguably was manufactured and made to happen. And that 2008 was kind of similar in that way. And those were major bank consolidation plays. And I think there's going to be an effort to consolidate the industry, the banking industry, even further in the US with the next crisis. And then those banks are going to be like, well, here you go, tokenized deposits, redeem them this way, or stable coins, or, you know, JP Morgan's JPM coin or something like that, transact with that. Wells Fargo's working on one. You know, a lot of these, you know, the biggest banks in the US have done that, and then they'll be able to keep the two-tier banking system in the US the way it is now, but frame it as something, you know, maybe different than it is. We're just modernizing this, and this is going to prevent these crises from happening again. And maybe we'll roll in Bitcoin so that the dollar stays strong and you don't have to worry about hyperinflation. And, you know, I think people, in considering what kind of crisis it is, you know, may really see that as the right solution. But this is something that, again, they've been, you know, developing for quite a long time. And I think if people were to critically think about what a lot of this means, they would not support it, because ultimately, you know, a lot of the uproar about CBDCs, again, was about programmability and surveillability. And I mean, getting every American onboarded onto something that would essentially offer that and eliminate cash overnight, maybe, you know, is something that people would, again, acquiesce to during a crisis, but not during a non-crisis time.
So
this kind of echoes the talk that I had with Ed Dowd, because he forecasts something really similar. And it's crazy to see how much stable coins have grown, especially some of the really big ones like Circle and Tether. And yet they are very opaque. I mean, they won't release, they're not very transparent about their reserves. But then you have maybe really big legacy money managers coming out saying, oh no, I've seen everything. And they totally have all the dollars that back up the stable coins. But I mean, literally anyone could launch this, right? And say, okay, I've created now 500,000 stable coins, and I have the $500,000 to back them up, and it's one for one. But how do you really know? Because all of this is, again, centralized, right? And like, there's such a demand for the dollar around the world. So it probably will.
You would need a 3-letter agency, right, to be created to go in and check the reserves, right? If this is a stable coin that's created in the US, or if US residents are using that stable coin, right? I mean, you know, it gets into really muddy waters, right? Because if they did that, you'd have KYC that they would require to use that stable coin, right? But there has to be some way to hold these people accountable, right? Tether is offshore. So could the US really do anything if we found out that Tether doesn't have the money to back? It would just be really catastrophic if that news came out, because I think you would see Tether depeg. And, you know, that could cause a black swan event in the crypto industry. And so it's good that more stablecoins are being created. I think the people behind them and the companies behind them really matter. And it's good that, a company like Ripple, who I trust implicitly, I really think Brad Garlinghouse is steering that ship well. Chris Larson, I think they have an incredible team, and they're trying to really build out a digital future that we can all use. But some of these companies like Tether, I do worry about.
Will be a lot of incentive for the US government, being sort of the superpower, to try to take all of these under its purview or under its wings, so that they see everything that's happening, because they don't like offshore dollars, right?
Yeah, so you sort of touched on something that I want to point out for a second, because I think it's really important. So as this relates to demand for dollars abroad, I think is very important. So what you're seeing in economies outside of the US that have major inflation issues, Argentina, a good example, are people flocking into dollar stablecoin. In Argentina, obviously it makes sense to do that for regular Argentines that don't want to lose their purchasing power. But if you look at why Argentina is in the situation it is in now, they've been the subject of economic warfare since like the late 70s. And a lot of that was done by US intelligence working with the biggest Wall Street banks to do that, who became sort of the debt barons and quote unquote vulture capitalists targeting Argentina, and sort of resulting in a lot of this. Well, first their economic collapse in 2001, and then everything downstream of that. And a lot of people involved in that in various administrations were Argentines that had worked for these Wall Street banks like JP Morgan, for example. And so, historically, what a lot of unscrupulous players in the US power establishment have tried to do, as the Latin American debt crisis has, waxed and waned since the 1980s, is dollarize various economies. So, of course, this happened in El Salvador. It happened in Ecuador. They stopped having their own currency. They essentially lose their financial sovereignty and are at the whims of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
So if you get everyone onto dollar stable coins, you're essentially, if you can do sort of like what Milei proposed, dollarizing Argentina, well, maybe he doesn't necessarily have to do formal dollarization like in the past anymore. He can just onboard everyone onto dollar stable coins. But the way it services US debt and expands dollar hegemony, and also, expands the soft political power of the US, because the US, it's important to keep in mind, I think around 2008 or 2009, WikiLeaks published a leaked military manual where they described the IMF, the World Bank, and various other institutions as financial weapons of the US military. And so there's this whole idea of using, basically these institutions which saddle countries with debt. So basically using debt as a weapon, and all these different financial weapons to keep governments around the world in line. And so if you onboard them all onto Tether, for example, which is very prominent in Argentina, but Tether is partnered with the FBI and the Secret Service, and has Paulo Arduino has openly said that Tether is going to be a world-class partner to expand US dollar hegemony globally, and freeze the wallets of whoever, OFAC and the Treasury says their wallet needs to be freezed for reasons X, Y, and Z, regardless of what it is. They will do so, and then they'll lose their financial sovereignty as a nation, but by other means, right? So I think what we're seeing is a way to sort of covertly make a new model for dollarization. And, I think people like Larry Summers, I think he was on the podcast of Jeremy Allaire, who runs Circle, was essentially saying that this is what stable coins are doing. And of course, Larry Summers was Secretary of the Treasury at the end of the 90s when countries like Ecuador were dollarized. So he intimately knows how that works. And he also used to have a leading role at the World Bank.
All right, guys, I'm going to leave the entire interview down in the description so you can come watch the rest of this. But I think there's a lot of issues with what's currently happening with stablecoins, and I think as a country, or as people in the US or other places, need to address this as a people. It's really difficult, right? Because what power do we have? There's so many other things that are going on in our lives. Do we really want to kind of bother with this, or just let it play out? And I think that's kind of what the situation and the more broader problem is currently, right? Is as these stablecoin issuers are partnering up with three-letter agencies, and who knows what they'll be able to stop, right? I think PayPal went through something like this, right, where people were getting fined and doing for saying the wrong thing and stuff like that. So man, it's a crazy world. I hope you got value out of this video. I'll see you next time. Aloha.